What's up? Alexander here with Date Psychology. So, Chapter 4 today, Oxford Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology, Romantic Relationships, Partner Evaluation and Selection. Let's go ahead and go forward. The paper today that we're looking at, the chapter in this book, same name, Partner Evaluation and Selection. Let's go on now. Next slide. What are we looking at? Some basic background they go over here. Basic evolutionary psychology. We've talked about this in the previous chapters. Going to recap because they recap at the beginning of this chapter. What do we know? People vary in mate value, right? Across a bunch of different traits. We've kind of covered what some of those are. We also know that mate selection is non-random. People prefer certain traits, so they select mates with those traits. What else do we know? The sex with higher investment in offspring, which is females and human beings, women, is choosier or more selective, and that also means that the sex with lower investment, males and human beings, competes to be chosen, okay? Investment level depends on the mating context, right? So short or long term. And when we see differences in investment that are large, we also tend to see large sex differences here as well. So, for example, the Clark and Hatfield line of research, I made a video on this way back. Look it up, look for it. It's pretty interesting. What did Clark and Hatfield do? Harder to get approval for this kind of study today, but they were able to do this back in the day. They sent researchers, people on their team, men and women of different levels of attractiveness, to approach random people on campus. And these researchers could say, will you go on a date with me? Will you come home with me to sleep with me, or whatever the case may be? Most of the men, when approached by an attractive woman, they just say, yes, I'll sleep with you. Almost none of the women do. So we see this really big sex differences, very well replicated across the research in kind of this willingness to have sex with an attractive stranger, right? Men, they have a very high orientation toward casual sex. We see that on measures like sociosexuality, effectively a measurement of that. Women, on the other hand, very low orientation toward casual sex, reflecting sex differences in behavior, investment being large when, sex differences in investment are large. But we've also evolved for biparental care and long-term pair bonding, right? And that's actually the dominant human mate pattern. Let's go on now. Next slide. So, some key long-term mating preferences here. What do we know? Human beings, one of about 3 to 9% of mammals that form long-term pair bonds. So, humans are kind of unique in that we form committed, long-term, monogamous relationships with one person for a very long period of time. It's not usually like perfect pair bonding, like a prairie vole or something where like the first person you mate with is who you stay with your entire life, but we form these very long pair bonds, right? This is the dominant human mating pattern, these long-term relationships, okay? Men and women, they both invest very highly in long-term relationships, and because investment is similar, the sex differences here are smaller, right? Men and women become highly selective when selecting long-term partners, and they tend to care about some similar things to the same extent, but there's also sex differences here. We know men care about signs of youth, fertility, that sort of thing. Women, on the other hand, care more about status, ambition, industriousness, and these are traits that signal you can acquire resources or that you have resources. These are very robust sex differences across cultures, so something that's very well replicated across cultures as well. We also see these sex differences even in gay men and women. So even in individuals that are not heterosexual, we still see these evolved preferences emerge. For example, gay men higher in sociosexuality, gay women lower in sociosexuality. Gay men show a stronger preference for physical attractiveness. Women show a stronger preference for investment, gay women, that kind of a thing, for kindness, etc., etc., etc. So, as I mentioned, for these long-term relationships, there's still some shared traits where you see smaller sex differences, all right, that would benefit both parties as far as investment in a long-term relationship is concerned. So intelligence, warmth and trustworthiness, agreeableness, good parenting skill, kindness, honesty. These are all things that emerge very highly in mate preferences, particularly in long-term contexts, and that are very valuable for men and women. You don't see big sex differences on these. Let's go on now to the next slide. Some key short-term mate preferences. So, as we mentioned, long-term relationships, the most common human mating pattern, the dominant human mating pattern. But short-term relationships, and specifically, casual sex, it's not that uncommon. A lot of people have done this. So what do we know about situations like this? Parental investment is low, so the desire for resources is low. It's particularly low for males, right? So men are more inclined to engage in this, and men invest much less in this, right? The investment potential for women is still pregnancy, caring for offspring. For a man, it's very, very low. So what happens in a situation like this where potential investment is low? Selection for genetic quality, for heritable traits, goes up. And this is often just signs of physical attractiveness, okay? We see that physical attractiveness is valued more by men and women in short-term mating context. And this is also, what we see in animals as well. As we mentioned, only 3 to 9% of mammals even form these pair bonds. You look at other non-mammal species, it's very similar. Often there's no biparental care at all. So what is being selected for in situations like this? Good genes, right? That's basically it. Signs of mate quality physically, and often those are things like symmetry, as we mentioned in the past chapters. Symmetrical mates, very robustly picked across animal species, not just human beings. So, something else can be said from this section about the role of ovulation. I have another video up, the dual sexuality framework by Gangstead, Hasselton, researchers who research the effects of ovulation specifically, right? Many animals only have sex when conceptive, when fertile, and throughout the rest of the cycle, they do not. Human beings are a little bit different. Human beings evolved to have an extended sexuality or a dual sexuality. Sexual behavior that occurs during ovulation, the conceptive phase, and continuous sexuality. The desire, ability, willingness to have sex across the menstrual cycle. So, what do we know about this? Very consistently, women have heightened sexual desire when ovulating, heightened libido, more arousal. That's a very robust observation, replicable, okay? But there's no increased desire to just mate indiscriminately, okay? So heightened arousal doesn't necessarily just apply to have sex with whoever. That's not necessarily fitness enhancing. Is there evidence for shifts in mate preferences? The dual sexuality framework video, go and see that, covers all of the research on this, and I think mentioned in some of these earlier chapters as well. Mostly null results here. There could be a non-zero shift, but it would be a very, very weak effect. That's typically the general state of the research at the moment. So rather than individuals switching their mate preference, perhaps, the effect of ovulation, heightened libido and desire simply magnifies mate preferences. There could be many interactions that we know about, but it's not likely that ovulation facilitates kind of this dual mating strategy that has become popular, right? Where different traits are selected when conceptive and not conceptive. Anyway, yeah, see that video. Next slide here, intermediate relationships. We talk a lot about long-term mating, short-term mating, but we actually see a lot of mating patterns that fall kind of in the middle, right? Not all relationships are short and long-term. We have hybrid relationships. Friends with benefits, booty calls, those sorts of things, right? So these are lower investment than a long-term committed relationship. It's not investment in a single person, commitment to one person. There's not a sharing of resources and an expectation of fidelity, but they are for extended periods of time. So they're not necessarily short-term either. Important to consider. Most casual sex, about 60%, is with friends. It occurs in these friends with benefits relationships. So there is kind of an ongoing long-term relationship there. It's not the case that it's simply one-night stands or casual sex with a stranger. That's actually much, much less common. I have an article about that as well from the General Social Survey Statistics looking at 2021, 2022, the most recent as well. You see the same thing in those, okay? So there's some sex differences here that we see because these are intermediate relationships. You might expect kind of intermediate mate preferences reflecting choices for short and long-term relationships in these, right? What do we know? Women are more likely to be emotionally invested in these intermediate relationships than men. And women are also more likely to desire that these turn into a long-term relationship. But most of these don't actually turn into a long-term relationship. We also know that for booty calls, long-term mate traits, right? The traits that signal this is a valuable long-term mate are also desired. So it's not like short-term mating where you would just expect selection for physical traits, for physical attractiveness. Perhaps because there's a desire for these to turn into long-term relationships and because they are extended, other traits are also desirable in these beyond just signs of physical good genes, so to speak. So these intermediate relationship patterns, they can kind of represent a compromise, right, between long and short-term mating patterns, right? Men are more oriented toward short-term than women. Women are a little bit more oriented toward long-term than men, although men also actually kind of have a dual sexuality in that sense, that if you look at men's desire for a monogamous relationship and men's desire for casual sex, they will report very high desire for both. Women, on the other hand, will report a very high desire for monogamous relationships, but a very low desire for casual sex. So there's kind of a compromise there, right? And that probably emerges in, the dominant mating pattern that we see, long-term pair bonding, and in these intermediate relationships, the traits in mates that are selected for kind of reflect both, right? Someone who's attractive enough that you want to have sex with them, that you're willing to do it casually, you're enjoying the sexual experience, but also that they have traits that signal, okay, this is someone that would actually be a good long-term partner. Consensual non-monogamy, the next slide here, this also is another form of kind of an intermediate relationship, right? Polyamory, open relationships, swinging. These are actually long-term relationships, but they have extradyadic sex in them, okay? So, or they can have, multiple long-term commitments with multiple people as well. So usually in these, there's a primary partner and then there's one or more secondary partners. And we also see some of these evolutionary mate patterns reflected here. Primary partners tend to resemble long-term mate partners a little bit more than secondary partners. They tend to be rated as more desirable, and they tend to also be mate guarded a little bit more. People tend to report that they have higher investment in their primary partners and also higher relationship satisfaction with these primary partners. But people also report more frequent sex with the secondary partners. So some of these relationships can also represent a compromise. Like, okay, we have this thing going on. Some of the traits that I desire are found a little bit more in this person. Other traits that I desire are found a little bit more in that person. So you can kind of see how needs are being met for different things from different partners, which is kind of an experience that people who engage in these consensually non-monogamous relationships will actually seem to be kind of aware of, that they will tell you, like, I find different things valuable in different partners. Anyway, next slide, mate preference priorities. As we said, mate selection, it's not random. People like certain traits, but that does raise a question. How do we value certain traits more than others? What's the most important? People ask me this all the time. What's the most important trait? Rank them from like 1, to 50,000 or something like that. There's a lot, and it's not clear that there is like a most important trait or a least important trait or anything like that. As we talked about in the previous video, we know that physical attraction functions kind of as a gate. That has to be met kind of as a minimum thing. Like the person's got to be attractive enough. You meet that looks test, all of these other things come into play, but that doesn't even mean that looks are necessarily the most important. What do we see? We see these between sex preferences, right? Where men and women value different traits differently. Men care more about physical attractiveness. Women care more about status, for example. Very robust. But when you look at between trait preferences, these are not the things that necessarily emerge as the most important. Attractiveness and status, they're actually not at the top of the list for most women. So why can that be? Probably because we prioritize mate preferences and we give these mate preferences a sort of incremental value, right? So say someone, can be a 1 through 10 on physical attractiveness. They might only need, to be a 6. They might only need to hit that minimum threshold before you get kind of diminishing returns in attractiveness. And the same could be true of kindness or resources or whatever the case may be. So a little bit of attractiveness or kindness or wealth or whatever, it's good enough to signal reproductive fertility, investment, whatever the case may be, right? Think about the purpose of male preference for attractiveness in a mate or youth or something like that. It's to signal fertility. So are we necessarily picking who is the optimal choice? Evolution doesn't tend to work that way. Evolution is not about picking the optimal or the very best. It's often about picking who simply is a satisficing choice, who meets those requirements, and then you can go on and consider kind of other things. So considering that, the looks test bar, it's kind of low. A lot of these traits matter, but meeting kind of, the satisfaction of each of these traits doesn't mean, someone has to be a 10 in this and a 10 in this and a 10 in this. Might be good enough, if they just have a lot of stuff across the board. So a little bit of status, similarly, can be kind of good enough to provide for offspring, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be the highest status person. Think about a budget, right? And this is kind of the model that's used here. How much do you have to spend on traits, and where would you allocate those traits when selecting a mate, right? You have $10 and some traits cost $2, some traits cost $3. You can only pick certain traits, right? You have to allocate like, okay, do I want to spend it all on someone who's attractive but has nothing else? Or will I say, okay, I'm going to spend $3 on attractiveness, $3 on sexual fidelity, right? $3 on, thinking like this person's much less likely to cheat on me. And here's another $2 in like kindness and agreeableness because I want to be able to get along with them. So people kind of make compromises in that sense, right? They look for these things kind of across the board. Let's go on now to the next slide. As I said, there's kind of this diminishing marginal return on most of these traits, right? You're not necessarily trying to get the absolute best in one trait, because the more time you spend to do that, the more you might miss out kind of on these other mates and other potentials, right? So that means that the most desirable mates are not necessarily the ones who have maxed out like one or two traits, like, he's attractive, but he has like nothing else going for him, or he's rich, or he has nothing going else for him. Rather, they tend to be well-rounded mates. It's like, okay, he's a little bit above average in attractiveness, and he's a little bit above average in industriousness. He's funnier than average, right? But maybe he's not, a professional comedian or whatever the case may be. Maybe he's not the most attractive man in the world, but he's ticking all of these boxes. He's hitting the bar, right? Not a 10 out of 10 on everything, but a 6 out of 10 on everything. But he's ticking all of the boxes. And that seems to be how these decisions are kind of made. What determines this budget, or how picky you can be, right? You think about it like, I'm allocated $10, and well, this person's allocated $20. Why? That's probably your own mate value that determines your budget, right? We know that individuals who have higher mate value themselves, they can be pickier, and also they're more likely to fulfill their mating goals in that sense. They're more likely to be able to pick a partner who actually ticks most of those boxes. So what we have described here, it's called the mate preference priority model. And as I said, it's about satisficing, not optimizing, as many things in evolution are. You have to tick the box of a good mate across multiple traits, but not max them out. Think about it like this. Think about a sheet, that's just boxes. Like, is he funny? Is he attractive? Just yes or no. You're literally just ticking a box. Now think about another sheet that's a bar. Every trait has a bar, like 1 through 10 on this, 1 through 10 on this, 1 through 10 on this. The box model seems to make a little bit more sense. Kind of like, is he ticking the boxes? How many of these boxes has he ticked? He ticked a lot of boxes, high value mate right there. Rather than like, where is he on all of these traits? But, it probably is a little bit more like a bar. But in a sense, if you think about it like this, like how many boxes do they tick? How many minimum thresholds do they meet across all of these traits? Seems to kind of be how mate value works. So this is also something we see in animal behavior. As far as I talk about diminishing marginal return, the marginal value model, you can see this in animal foraging, right? So an animal comes across like a patch of food on the ground. Animals are moving from spot to spot. There's a lot of food here, right? Or there's a lot of apples in the tree. At first, you're just picking quickly. You're getting a lot of apples in the tree. But as that food goes down, you have to spend more time doing it. You're spending a lot of effort to extract resources from something now that does not have a lot of resources. So then you have to make the decision, like, when am I going to move on? And picking traits probably moves that way. So, you spent a lot of effort finding an attractive mate. They're an 8 out of 10. Are you going to spend more effort and time and putting more weight on like, oh, but I can get a little bit more attractive? Or are you going to move on to all of these other traits and be like, okay, I'm satisfied with the level of attractiveness. Now I want to consider a bunch of other stuff, right? Hope that makes sense. Let's go on now to the next slide. So, assessing overall mate value, because this is what constitutes mate value, right? It's not just like this trait's the most important and then this. It's kind of all of these overall things holistically. You got to tick many boxes, but you don't have to max out all of those status bars, right? So how do we assess kind of overall mate value here? There's a Euclidean algorithm. Conroy, Beam, and Bust, they did a recent paper on this, a good paper. And basically what this asks is, how far do the desired traits that you have in a mate deviate basically from your prioritizing of them, right? So, the formula for this is the sum of squared deviations between the mate's actual value of each trait and your desired value. So, if you're like, I need someone who's an 8 in attractiveness, they're a 5 in attractiveness. I need someone who's a 5 in kindness, they're a 4 in kindness, that kind of a thing. You're trying to minimize the distance between what you want, and there's individual variation here, right? This is going to be very idiosyncratic, these individual preferences, and what the other mate has. Some people prioritize physical attractiveness much more highly. Some people prioritize certain traits more highly. Some people like certain traits that others don't, like extroversion and introversion, right? So there's a lot of idiosyncrasy here, and there's a lot of individual differences here, right? And so mate value is relative to the individual and the kind of mate that they want, not that it's just totally random, right? Or that there's not shared preferences for traits or desirability, but it does vary from individual to individual, and how valuable a mate is going to be potentially to you is basically how narrow is that gap between all of these traits that you value and, kind of the standard that you have set there. We also kind of use compensatory decision making, okay? So traits really high in value to you, they can offset traits that are very low in value, right? So, maybe you prioritize physical attractiveness very highly, and you also prioritize wealth, medium highly. And you think, okay, this person's really physically attractive, but they're not really ticking the bar for wealth. Well, they've exceeded the physical attractiveness. That can kind of compensate. You might say, okay, I really like him because of this. He doesn't necessarily tick these other boxes, but it kind of offsets it a little bit. So that's another thing to consider there. Someone who cares a lot about attractiveness is going to have a more attractive mate. And we know, expressed and revealed preferences, they're kind of concurrent here, right? They're in concord. Individuals who say they want attractive mates more, they also are pickier as far as that goes, right? And the same for some other traits as well. Anyway, next slide. Talking about some modern platforms for selecting mates, right? Because, in the ancestral environment where we evolved all of our dating preferences, we didn't have Tinder or the internet or social media. Now we do. Dating apps, social media, these online environments, very novel things for mate selection. What do we know? Basic preferences for traits, mate preferences that are well replicated, they've kind of remained the same, right? People still value mates who are physically attractive and this and that. But people also calibrate their behavior to the new environment. So we know that men value physical attractiveness a little bit more than women do. So what do women do? They're more like, when they lie on dating apps or they exaggerate or something like that, they're more likely to lie about or exaggerate their physical attractiveness, more likely to try and enhance that. So they're trying to enhance characteristics consistent with what we know about male mating preferences. Men, on the other hand, what do? Men are more likely to try and signal status and wealth. They're more likely to lie about their income, that kind of a thing. So these evolved mate preferences, they're still reflected in the kinds of decisions that people make on apps and all of that. So posting one's level of education in a Tinder bio or another dating app kind of biography, what does that do? It boosts the likes or, the matches, that kind of a thing, the responses that men get. It doesn't for women, right? So that signal of industriousness, where we see a sex difference where women value it more, it works for men. It's still selected for in dating apps, not the other way around. Works the same for income, right? Women who post a higher income on dating apps, they don't get more likes and all of that. Men are just kind of considering physical attractiveness. Men who do, on the other hand, yeah, they get more matches, more likes, etc., etc. Let's go on now to the next slide. Speed dating paradigms. These are another kind of new research paradigm that lets people assess actual mate decisions, right? So revealed choices as far as things go. You meet strangers in person, you talk to them for about 5 minutes in a big circle, you're talking to one person, boom, you're talking to the next person, you're talking to the next person, and then at the end of the experiment, you can rate them on long-term, short-term desirability, but also you can say, I picked this guy or girl, I want to go on a date with them in the future. So people can actually meet through these. So there's actual mate selection to be looked at. This research, this whole line of research, has kind of raised some questions about evolutionary predictions, because what do we see kind of across this research? Men and women in speed dating paradigms, they often value attractiveness the same, okay? And we also don't seem to see sex differences in selection for other traits like status, which is contrary to what, the evolutionary hypotheses kind of predict, right? Where men should care about attractiveness more, women should care about status more. What do we actually see in these speed dating paradigms? Attractiveness, it's just simply at the top. It emerges as the best predictor of being selected, both for men and for women. Education and income, right? They're supposed to be very valuable to women. What about in these speed dating paradigms? They're way, way lower. They don't seem to matter very much at all. They're simply not, they're very low factor as far as like who actually gets picked for a date. So this kind of raises questions about stated versus revealed preferences. If you go into these speed dating paradigms, you ask people ahead of time, what do you want in a mate? And they're like, oh, I want someone who's kind, and I want someone who they're extroverted and they're intelligent and they have a high income. And then you see who they actually pick, and it's just like the hot guys and the hot girls. Yeah, then you kind of see a mismatch between stated and revealed preferences. Stated preferences don't always predict in these paradigms who actually gets picked. People say they want something, and then they just predict the attractive mate. Let's go on now to the next one. So we still do see some, evolutionary predictions emerge in these speed dating paradigms. Women are pickier. Men pick more women than women pick men, okay? Consistent, right? With parental investment theory and all of that. Some questions have been raised about speed dating paradigms. So there's kind of a debate at the moment between kind of the team of Eastwick and Finkel, who have designed a lot of these speed dating paradigms, and evolutionary psychologists on the other side, about how well these things kind of I guess, generalized, right? Ecological validity. How well do the speed dating paradigms actually apply to real world mate choices and that kind of a thing? So one of those is that speed dating events, they might not actually have enough poor or unattractive participants, right? So these are very often kind of affluent, college educated people or something like that. So they're very, very homogenous. You're not getting a lot of people who are like very, very poor. And so what does that mean? People might realize like, okay, this is a pretty homogenous environment. The minimum bar, remember, as we talked about in kind of this model, right, of satisfying the minimum bar of all of these traits, so to speak. You know, the minimum bar has been met for social status and affluence and all of that. These are kind of people on my level. They're all the same. So then what is left? How do you distinguish between mates? At that point, you're going in a big circle. Physical attractiveness, right? So it's not that those other things aren't being considered. Rather, it could be that those other things are being considered and everyone is just ruled kind of, okay, off the bat, they're kind of the same. So people might assume this kind of homogeneity of status. They might then go on to select for attractiveness, right? Mating priorities model. Follow-up dating, speed dating studies, they've also kind of provided some evidence of this, right? When they've managed to get very low status individuals to participate in these speed dating paradigms, very low income individuals, they do actually get picked less. So that's kind of important that, you know, you need kind of a whole range of traits if you actually want to know if those traits are being selected for or against. We also know in these that people who say they value physical attractiveness very highly, they do place more importance on physical attractiveness in speed dating paradigms. So we see some concordance there between stated and revealed preferences. And we also know that non-physical traits, when you ask people aside from picking, like would you value them for a long-term relationship, short-term relationship, those do actually predict like who people say, yeah, they're going to be more desirable as a long-term partner. Okay, so there's a big debate on this, stated versus revealed preferences between, as I mentioned, kind of the Eastwick team who does a lot of the speed dating research and evolutionary psychologists and all of that. More needs to be done on that. And we'll kind of talk about that in a minute here. Let's go on to the next slide. Mismatched mating preferences. What does this mean when we see kind of a mismatch between these stated and revealed preferences, particularly in the context of speed dating, okay? Could be constraints in the mating market, as we mentioned, you know, if it's a very homogenous group of people, everyone is the same status isn't going to come into play, right? And that's also true as far as who people actually pick out in the real world. You know, people can say, I want someone who's very high status, but if their actual mating market, the people available to them are all kind of middle class, they're going to end up with someone middle class, right? So, you know, it's kind of like women say they want someone who's 6 feet tall and they got a six pack and they make six figures, like great. You can, you know, women have been saying they want Prince Charming since the beginning of time. You can say that. That's not necessarily going to be what someone actually picks. Who people actually pick is going to be determined by who is in their mating pool and who ends up kind of right in front of them, right? Kind of imperfect information as well. So there was an interesting speed dating study that looked at intelligence. We know people say that they want an intelligent mate. Who got picked during the speed dating study? Was it more intelligent people? No, it was the most attractive people. But the people that got picked, more attractive people, said, yeah, they're more intelligent. You know, they gave them, I think, Raven's matrices or the Wechsler, I'm not sure which of the two, and they measured their intelligence. Yeah, there was no relationship between intelligence and who got picked. So people don't always know, you know, that the person that they're interested in actually has the traits that they like. And, you know, if you're having a 5-minute interaction with someone in a speed dating context, that's not necessarily long enough to assess all of these other traits to really know, is it? Which is often, you know, it's not an entirely naturalistic condition, like, you know, you've known someone for a couple of years and got to know them, or, you know, you've shared a class with someone over the course of a semester and then you ask them on a date. You know, in a lot of naturalistic conditions, people have time to get to know someone. They can assess like, okay, I like these traits or not before they make a decision. Tinder, also the same way. What information do you really have available? Not much. It's just a picture. You know, people often don't even read the bios, although women actually kind of tend to, right? Male bios do increase likes, but there's a lot of imperfect information there. That can kind of create a mismatch between like stated and revealed preferences as well. What else could it be? Just a lack of self-awareness, right? That people, you know, say, I want all of these things, but they really don't care that much, okay? Compromise, right? People say, I want all of these things as well, but then, you know, as I said, who they pick is constrained by who is actually available to them. So everyone can want Prince Charming. They can say, you know, they want the perfect person on paper, but at the end of the day, they have to kind of make a compromise like, okay, you know, I don't necessarily need Prince Charming. I'm perfectly happy, you know, with the nice guy down the street. Evolutionary mismatch, also important here. What is that? This is when modern environments do not actually match the evolved ancestral environments that all of our mate preferences developed in, right? So, we grew up in bands, I should say our ancestors evolved in bands of, 100 people or so, small communities where you knew everyone from birth. If you ever saw a person in front of you, you might have known everything about them. Very different from modern cities, with millions of people, social media apps where you're swiping across a bunch of photos of strangers, etc., etc. So, mate choices that were once adaptive in ancestral environments can now be maladaptive, right? Things that might have been signals like, okay, this is a good mate now, maybe they don't signal that in a modern environment. We can even see this in examples of humans and animals mating with non-human objects, okay? So sex dolls, AI girlfriends, they satisfy this need for sex, for emotional investment. Beetles, there's a species of beetles, they mentioned in this paper, that instead of mating with other beetles, it goes and it finds beer bottles because the beer bottle kind of triggers some desire that they have for kind of like a gleamy, glossy shell, okay? So you can have these evolutionary mismatches where something new comes into the environment and it signals like, this is something really good to mate with. Turns out it's actually not. Pornography, another example, right? We see sex differences in this also, don't we, that reflect these evolved mate preferences. Men consume visual pornography. Women consume much more text, erotica, right? And you see kind of that desire for sex with strangers, that kind of visual desire. And in contrast, female erotica often has a long story with emotional investment and that sort of thing. So you still see kind of these sex differences and kind of like what the pseudo relationships that men and women desire. Men, sex. Women, this kind of like emotional investment with intensity and all of that. Anyway, next slide. Misrepresentations of desirable mates. Contrast effects. What are these? This is something that is an effect we've seen on dating apps and also can occur on social media and other paradigms. If you present a bunch of pictures of attractive women to a man, he will report after that as an acute effect being less satisfied with the woman that he's with, okay? And we see the same for like text vignettes, descriptions of men who are like high in status or dominant to women. Women are reading a bunch of stories about dominant men and then, they're less satisfied with their actual boyfriend, okay? So this is a problem here in the sense that this is not the kind of environment, again, that human beings evolved in. We were not exposed to, Instagram and like hundreds of pictures of highly attractive people and stories of very successful people, high status, just kind of piped into your brain by the algorithm over and over and over. We know that these things reduce relationship satisfaction. They reduce life satisfaction. They make people less happy through a mechanism that's called upward social comparisons, right? You think about ancestral environments, there's always a status hierarchy, but it's a little bit more flat than, something like on Instagram where you're just seeing like the most beautiful people and like the most high status people nonstop. And you're like, wow, their lives are great. My life is terrible. So we know that that impacts mental health in a negative way. We didn't evolve to distinguish between actual, potential mates or others in the environment and fox mates, right? Or faux mates, I should say. I think I pronounced that wrong. But, we tend to see these things. They still have the same effect. It's enough just to see pictures of things like that. For our ancestors, if something resembled a person, it was probably a person, and we know that areas in the brain that are activated when looking at a live human face, they're activated when looking at a picture of a face as well. So yeah, they trick us. They trick our emotional system. They trick a lot in our brain, apparently just being exposed to all of these pictures and that sort of a thing. As I said, think about the potential effects that social media has where you're just bombarded with this. Okay. Also, something else to consider, as short-term mating becomes more normalized, so does valuing physical attractiveness more, right? We know physical attractiveness is valued more in short-term mating contexts. The dominant human mating pattern is long-term mating, but, we do see cultural shifts normalizing short-term mating and also these intermediate relationships, right? So, as short-term mating becomes more and more common, and it's still not the most common, but, increasingly common, then we're going to see more of a premium on physical attractiveness. And, the speed dating thing kind of highlights that, right? You're going into a room with complete strangers. You're talking to a bunch of strangers in a big circle. So you have contrast effects there, right? What does that do? It just makes you kind of say, I don't know these people very well. I can't select for any other traits. All I really have to go on is physical attractiveness. You're probably considering something short term, not necessarily, but, it's an environment that kind of primes that. Yeah, so physical attractiveness emerges kind of at the top. Tinder, a very similar effect, as I mentioned, kind of to these speed dating paradigms. You're just exposed to a bunch of faces, so there's contrast effects. And we know, as well, not mentioned in this, but in past research on Tinder, the more someone swipes on Tinder, the more selective they become. The less attractive further profiles look to them, okay? So yeah, the more competition out there, it's like being exposed to a huge potential mate pool, even though often that's not our real potential mate pool. Let's go on now. So what else as far as these mismatches? Anonymity and sex ratio, okay? In ancestral societies, you couldn't just be anonymous that well. These were small groups, you knew everyone, you grew up with them. So there's a lot of social control there. There's expectations. People, you have a reputation. People know how you're going to behave. Your whole permanent record, so to speak, is recorded in the minds of all of your peers. That also means everyone knew who you mated with. So the cost of short-term sex would be much higher, right? People, take for example, I think it's in the Hadza, I think, where there's the very high rates of extra pair paternity, people still are able to keep track in those of like who's probably the father of who, even when these bands kind of separate and go elsewhere. So people kind of know about like short-term mating, long-term mating, whose child belongs to who, okay? When there's high levels of, anonymity in a society, it's kind of a buffer for reputation loss, assuming that, short-term sex, selecting a bad mate, even as a long-term partner, could be a loss of reputation, so that can facilitate higher willingness to engage in short-term mating. Men as well can withhold investment more easily. So imagine, in a small society where everyone knows everyone, if a man gets a woman pregnant, there's strong social pressure, like you have to take care of her now, you have to marry her, you have to take care of the kid, that is your kid, right? Not necessarily the case in a modern environment, so these things kind of incentivize short-term mating. What else do we know? Sex ratio does that. When there's a female lopsided sex ratio. So on a lot of college campuses, you have a sex ratio of 3-to-1, right? For every one man, there's 3 women. What do we know about that? And we talked about that in past videos as well. When there are more women than men in an environment, women shift their orientation towards short-term mating a little bit, right? So it's not just like women go from desiring long-term mating to short-term mating, no, but they become more open to short-term mating. They become more open to promiscuity and that kind of a thing. That's what a surplus of women in the environment does, and that kind of reflects kind of compromising in favor of male mating strategies. Why? Because there's fewer men, so the women have to kind of engage in more competition for those men, which means having sex earlier, using sex to secure a mate, that kind of a thing. So having kind of this sex ratio that we see in certain environments can also kind of incentivize short-term over long-term mating. So these are all kind of examples of novel environments, modern environments, evolutionary mismatch. In modernity, what do we see here? Greater prioritization of physical attractiveness, probably a general trend, right? A higher acceptance of casual sex, right? And also an increase in short-term. Really, we say short-term, but it might actually be more like these hybrid relationships, friends with benefits, right? But we see kind of an increase in these over long-term committed relationships. Anyway, this chapter kind of jumped around a little bit. They kind of go from one thing to another, and it kind of covered some other topics, but I've walked you through it. Chapter 4 in the Oxford Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology and Romantic Relationships. This is the last slide. Join the channel, like, subscribe, hit the bell, sign up to the Patreon, help support the project. I will make another video for you very soon. Chapter 5 up next.